Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for WordPress Accessibility Day 2022. My name is Devin Egger, Senior Software Developer at HTC and writer at MasterWP, and I'm your host for the final session today. Well, gang, the sun is up, the birds are chirping, and we've made it through a full 23 hours of learning and sharing about accessibility and WordPress. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. Truly a stand-up job from all the presenters, volunteers, and organizers for this year's event. A huge thank you to everyone involved for making this happen. Just as a quick note, we did have a question pop up in the Q&A from the last presentation asking, when will the recordings be published and available on YouTube? The answer to this question and other similar questions you might have can be found on the FAQ page of the WordPress Accessibility Day website at wpaccessibility.day/FAQ. Following this session, we'll have a live Q&A session with Damon, our presenter, so please remember to join us in Slido. That's the chat section just to the side or below the video you're watching now. You can post your questions in the Q&A section or just join the conversation in the ideas section. All right, we're down to our final presentation, folks. One I know a bunch of us have been waiting for. Coming up is Damon Cook with Dialogues, Modals, and Pop-Ups. Damon is a developer advocate at my favorite hosting provider, WP Engine. Previously, he navigated the WordPress agency land for around a decade. He's a purveyor and discoverer of musical frisson. He can be found in the realms of WordPress Slack, WooCommerce Slack, and Twitter. All right, without further ado, here's Damon. Take it away, Damon.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining me today at WordPress Accessibility 2022. I'm Damon Cook, a developer advocate at WP Engine. Formerly, I spent over a decade as a front-end developer in a variety of WordPress-centric agencies. Today, I'm here to talk about modals, pop-ups, dialogues, lightboxes, and alerts. These are all pretty common terms often used to describe similar website interfaces we often interact with on a daily basis. Some love them, some hate them, and they're often an evil necessity. First, I want to differentiate some of the common native dialogues we often see from the non-native dialogues. Next, we'll dive into the differences between modals, lightboxes, and pop-ups. With an understanding of the differences between these interface terms, we can then dive into some best practices for implementing dialogues and create a clear pathway for users to access our site's content. The later half of my presentation will take a deep dive into code where we step through building up an ideal dialogue experience. But first, I want to start with a little personal story. I don't know about you, but I'm getting old. In the past few years, I've been experiencing some mild chronic back pain. It is from years of sitting and general inactivity. I started stretching and walking to try and combat the persistent aches. I use my walks to enjoy time in nature and appreciate all the simple things I can. My breath, my movement, and my senses are all at the forefront of these experiences. Most of the time, I stick to the same path. It is a city-owned nature trail which snakes between the Hudson River on one side and a canal on the other side. Throughout my years of walking this path, I've encountered obstacles. Sometimes after a storm, there'll be a large tree trunk across the path. Other times, I've been chased by monstrous Canadian geese protecting their family. In a lot of ways, these obstacles are similar to pop-ups. They can inhibit the flow of walking or deter the whole activity altogether, which was the case for me when the geese were nesting. Why do I share this? Well, we're all constantly being made aware of our mortality through various small and sometimes dramatic experiences. Perhaps our vision or hearing is degrading, or in my case, my mobility has been a challenge. Old age is a common thread we can all somehow relate to, and ultimately, we're all just temporarily abled. So why not build a web for our future selves? Well, we're currently Whether you're currently visually impaired, have severe motor issues, mobility challenges, or are on a migratory path to any one of these experiences, it is imperative to build for everyone to access and use our content on the web. So let's dig in on how to create better pathways with dialogues. First, I want to clarify these different user interface patterns and compare their similarities and differences. Often these words, dialogue, alert, lightbox, pop-up, prompt, and modal, can become intertwined. Let's start with what I classify as built-in or native dialogues. These native dialogues allow for communication between the user and the system and are typically styled by the browser or operating system that is displaying them. I'm sure we've all experienced these types of dialogues on our devices. These interfaces are often where developers begin their journey because JavaScript allows for quick access to things like window.alert, window.prompt, window.confirm, and even window.print JavaScript methods. Again, these are fine and dandy for allowing the users to interface directly with the browser. Common use cases for native dialogues are system access permissions, like allow this site to access your microphone, or destructive actions, like are you sure you want to quit Safari? You have 782 tabs open, which is often the case for me. These dialogues can be broken down further by action types, like 1, 2, and 3 action dialogues, which refer to the amount of button options available for each prompt. The remaining user interface patterns besides native dialogues are modals, pop-ups, and lightboxes. For the most part, these are non-native implementations, whereas developers have the option to control and manipulate their appearance. Hence, it is far more common to encounter these on a web page. These can be differentiated by the idea that they all pop up and typically have an overlay or semi-opaque background behind them. The overlay background may indicate that the items behind cannot be accessed while the dialog is open. We'll dive into the nuances of this particular concept in a bit when it comes to best practices. The first non-native user interface is pop-ups. Pop-ups represent components that pop up on the user's screen and typically display marketing material. Usually, these pop-ups appear on page load and can be synonymous with landing pages. One example is the ubiquitous Join Our Mailing List form that encourages users to sign up and receive emails. Lightboxes are the next example of a non-native interface that is usually associated with images and pop up to enlarge a respective thumbnail image on the page. Last, we have modals, which are typically triggered with the user's initiation. An example of this is a login modal, which would pop up a form with a background overlay and allow a user to sign in to their account. You may ask, when should I use a dialogue? And this is a great question, something to always ask ourselves when tempting the idea. It can seem easy to tuck content away in a dialogue if screen estate becomes an issue, especially on smaller mobile devices. However, it introduces context switching, which has its own set of complicating factors. And at the end of the day, if something is going to be hidden away in an off-screen dialogue, then it should be considered whether it is necessary and whether the hidden content could instead be prioritized into the existing document flow. Best practices. Now, Let's dive in on what makes an ideal dialogue experience for any and all users to access our content. But first, did you know that there is already a dialogue HTML element? Wild, right? Unfortunately, the implementation between browsers can be wildly inconsistent, and still, it largely requires JavaScript to work. For example, currently in Chrome, clicking the backdrop of this native element does not dismiss the dialog. Also, the styling for the dialog element is left to each browser's discretion, which is never ideal. Fortunately, we have Kitty Ghirardelli's A11Y dialog lightweight JavaScript package, which is the recommended tool for creating dialogues on the web today. Kitty's package has been extensively tested and documented, and they're constantly revisiting additional testing and updates to the package. This package follows the dialog modal pattern from the ARIA authoring practices guide and is unopinionated with CSS styling, and it is lightweight. Again, here's an overview of best practices, and we'll dive into these one by one. Being mindful to maintain focus, semantic markup buttons versus links, and allow for keyboard interaction. One thing I like to note when building these complex custom interfaces is that before you reach for ARIA roles, always consider whether you're using the right HTML markup. ARIA can update the accessibility tree, but does nothing for displaying or altering functionality on a page. Ultimately, HTML with a sprinkle of CSS, then some JavaScript. This is the ideal order of operation when it comes to creating a progressively enhanced experience. Here, I have an image from a website. It's a music review site, which contains a dialogue. As the user visits the site, the dialogue after about, I think, 30 seconds shows up on the screen and prompts the user for a newsletter form to subscribe. To go over some of the takeaways here, when the dialogue has been opened, it is important to track focus on two things. Programmatically log the item that was last focused right before the dialog was opened. You can use the document.activeElement JavaScript for this, which is typically the element that triggered the action. And immediately shift focus to the most meaningful element within the dialog. We want to log the focus because we want to restore focus back to that element that had it before the dialog was open. Basically, we want to maintain the user's journey and not place them somewhere arbitrary, like the beginning or end of the document. However, once the dialog is opened, then we want to create a trap for tabbing and focus. If the user tabs forward, then they should be able to cycle through all tabbable items and can circuitously loop through them. One of those items should be the close button. Which element to focus when the dialog is opened depends on the type and amount of content within the dialog. Some ideas might be focusing the first element in the dialog, or focusing the close button, which gives the user a quick means to bail on the experience, or less common, set focus on the dialog itself. Here I've taken a short video demonstrating another music review site. And in this video, I am tabbing through, well, actually there is a dialogue which is presented on top of the existing page. And I'm tabbing through to show that the rest of the document is actually not inert below the dialogue, which is not ideal. This allows us to continue tabbing through the page in the background. And basically detracts from the whole dialogue experience. Once a dialogue is open, it is not only important to trap and maintain focus, but also be sure to make the rest of the document behind it dormant. This can be achieved by assigning ARIA modal true to the wrapping dialogue element. This signals to screen readers that the content beneath the dialogue are not part of the dialogue's content. It is important to remember that ARIA only updates the accessibility tree, and setting ARIA modal equals true does nothing to modify the element's visual appearance or functionality. In other words, JavaScript and CSS is required. Again, this is the same music review site, and with the same dialogue presented in a video that I've captured, and I'm demonstrating how with the dialogue open, the page behind it is still scrollable, which is typically not ideal. So also keep in mind that when a dialogue is open, the window will still process scroll events. This can usually be fixed by adding a class to the HTML element when the dialogue is open, and setting some CSS for overflow Y hidden. But this is not always bulletproof, and things can quickly get complicated when you're targeting different devices or if you're dealing with multiple CSS position elements on the page. Kitty offers some basic scroll locking techniques within the A11Y dialog package. And also there is a body scroll lock package for a foolproof and lightweight JavaScript solution. Now let's dig in on marking up a dialogue. Semantic markup is a great thing. We can start scaffolding the markup for a dialogue by locating the actual dialogue content outside of the main element content of the page. Most importantly, the dialogue and main content are still co-located in the document, but the dialogue logistically represents a whole other document when opened, which is important to remember, as this can confuse assistive technologies if not accounted for. Next, we can add the hidden attribute to our wrapping dialog div container. This will hide the div from the page and screen readers, and we do not have to worry about any flashing content on the page load until we're ready to display the dialog. A quick aside, buttons versus links, the age-old battle. Buttons are best for clickable actions like sign up, download, or open. Also, if you want a user to trigger something with JavaScript, then usually you want a button. Links are best used to take users to another page or as an anchor to a different target on the same page. Oftentimes, developers will use a link because they do not know how to style a button to remove its button-like appearance. More often, you'll want a button to trigger a dialog open and a separate button within the dialog markup to close. Another common pitfall for developers is properly including an SVG icon in your button markup. Remember, if the icon is purely decorative, then hide it from screen readers with ARIA hidden true. Set focusable false for IE and avoid any additional tab stops. And set a class of screen reader text on a wrapping span around the text, which will position and pull the text off the screen, but when tabbed to, it'll still be visible to screen readers. Also use CSS to set pointer events none on the SVG if you want to refrain the element from your click events, which is typically the case. Now back to our markup. Now that we're equipped with a better understanding of buttons, let's get back to the markup in our dialog and add buttons to our overall markup. We'll add one for the opening trigger and one for the closing of the dialogue. Next thing, we'll want to incorporate our overlay, or sometimes called the backdrop. This will be the semi-opaque background behind the dialogue that helps visually establish the barrier between the main document and our dialogue document. Also note in the code that we're also introducing an additional wrapping div element around our actual dialogue content and assigning it the role of document. Assigning role document helps signal assistive technology that this is a browsable content that can be accessed in reading mode. This ARIA role is used in complex context switching widgets like a dialogue. Ultimately, we'll want to make sure that clicking events on the backdrop will close the dialogue, but we'll also want to be sure to distinguish the boundaries between the actual dialogue and the backdrop. The dialogue area itself should not trigger the closing, and just the backdrop and the close button. Next, we'll want to add a unique ID to our dialogue's main wrapping div element. This will help with instantiating it with JavaScript and allow for the possibility of having multiple dialogues on a page, each having a unique ID, of course. Also, we'll add ARIA hidden true for the initial state of our dialogue and to hide it from assistive technology. Last, we'll add an H1 element for our dialogue's title. This is significant for screen readers to be able to associate a title with this dialogue, which correlates with the ID that we assign to the dialogue's wrapping div in the ARIA labeled by attribute. To finalize the hookup for using the A11Y dialog package, we'll need to add the package's data attributes to target the show and hide action triggers. While we mostly covered the best practices with tabbing and focus order, one thing that is important to consider is if the dialogue's content has a lot of stuff, then you'll likely want to elevate the priority of the close button. Make it easy for users to opt out of the dialogue early. Also, be sure to use a button element because this affords keyboard navigation of using the Enter and Spacebar key to trigger the close and opening of the dialogue. Again, there's a screenshot here of the music review site dialog that is open, and it's showing the tab order that exists in this example. The first field is, or the first focused element is the email address field. The second and third are, the second one is Get New Music Friday, and the third is No Thanks, which would also dismiss the dialogue. And then there are a few links at the bottom to user agreement and privacy policy statements, which are also focusable. And then the last item, the seventh focus element, is the close button. And this is a pretty ideal experience for the tabbing order. This wouldn't be a presentation without touching on some WordPress existing components. Some examples of dialogues and other accessibility helpers within WordPress. If you were to build a custom block, the Gutenberg's WordPress components package contains a visually hidden component and a modal component. So it's always best to try to leverage Core's existing packages to line up with that. And then I also provided a link here for screen reader text class, which I believe WordPress also outputs in several instances, but you still have to incorporate the CSS into your theme or plugin to tie it together. Also in the since I think WordPress 5.8, the navigation block utilizes a dialog, and they're actually using a package called Micromodal, which is a JavaScript dependency to surface the toggle menu functionality. And I have a video here demonstrating in the Frost theme how to trigger open and close this mobile menu, which uses the micromodal, as I said. And there's a link at the bottom to an overview of the navigation block. I hope this presentation has helped you consider the right time when to use a dialogue and whether it is a most effective means of organizing your site's content. Please be sure to reach out on Twitter. I am at dcook, C-O-O-K, and share any examples of dialogues, whether they're good, bad. Reach out, and thanks for having me today. And if there's any questions in the chat, I'd be happy to follow up.
Awesome. Thanks, Damon. And wow, just truly great information. Thanks for sharing all that with us. Some really good stuff that we can benefit from. I know personally, I have to handle how to effectively build experiences like this pretty much every day. And if any of you are like me and watching everything that you shared, I'm asking myself, oh no, did I leave some users out on the last website that I built? And well, that's kind of the point of these presentations, this whole event, that this is accessibility is a journey, and we're all learning here no matter what level we're on. But seriously, thank you. We do have some questions. The first one from Joe Dolson. Are there any existing WordPress plugins that you know of that create a good functional dialogue?
Unfortunately, I have not recently researched the existing plugins that provide that. So no, I do not have an answer to that, but I would be happy to follow up probably on Twitter, because I would be curious myself to test out a few plugins and see which ones do a good job of it.
Likewise. And I'm wondering also if there's any good blocks as well. See, there is another question from Curtis. This is a good one. So are these specific WCAG guidelines related to the behavior and of modals and dialogues, or is everything that you talked about here just best practices?
They are best practices, but they also do relate to several key guidelines for sure around this type of widget, dialogue widget.
Okay, great. Let's see, a couple more. And Amber did chime in and said that Pop-Up Maker does a good job of doing good dialogues.
Oh, that's good to know.
Mm-hmm. See, we got another question in the chat from Darren. He said, in the accessible forms talk yesterday, they mentioned that you shouldn't put anything after the submit button on a form because the submit button is considered the end of the form. Do you have any comments on that regarding the dialogue that you showed? Are dialogues kind of like a special case with that? What's your thoughts there?
No, I think that would likely hold true as a best practice as well when the form exists in a dialogue. I would think, yes, definitely the submit button would be a great tab stop there. Besides, I guess, being able to cycle to the close. That's a good question. Yeah, I think it's probably going to be a based on context and preference in a way. There could be, especially if the form is really long, you might want to get to the close button quick and give the option. But yeah, that submit button would probably be key as well. So
I agree. Oh, there's more questions popping up. This is great. So question from Anonymous. If a site has an alert pop-up that is used during an emergency, it covers the front page and has a close button. Any suggestions for accessibility?
There is I believe it's a special ARIA role alert dialog, which the A11Y dialog package also accounts for. But I think there definitely are some further considerations in that instance, because you'll want to surface additional information as to, and if there's any timing on the action, whether it's something that is going to, if it's a dialogue that's going to appear and then go away after a certain amount of time,
Right.
surfacing that information to screen readers is key, so that everybody knows what's going on, if that dialogue is going to come and go, and how long the action is you have to take on the action.
Right. And if there's like urgency or involved, or if that dialogue is also going to probably, maybe if that dialogue is going to affect your experience coming back to the website, I'm thinking.
Right.
That's a really good question. We do have another question, and I'm gonna scope this down just a little bit. What are some of the biggest mistakes developers make in regards to modals, dialogues, pop-ups? I have a couple I can think of in mind, but what's your thoughts on that, Damon?
I think the two I tried to highlight was whether to use a button or a link to trigger them. I think the button usually affords so much more, and it's usually just a case of a developer doesn't feel like unstyling a button, which is unfortunate. But yeah, usually a button is the best case in those scenarios. But then also the other thought I have is setting focus in the modal. Lots of times that's a common, they just kind of skip that idea and open up the modal and just leave it to whatever experience happens. But that's a key thing is setting focus there.
I totally agree. And one thing I can think of also, especially when like the modal is a search, and so if you click on the search magnifying glass and it pops open a modal for the search, make sure that focus goes to the search, right?
Right. Yeah, definitely.
Let's see. There's a good question from Amber here. Are there any special considerations for modals or pop-ups on mobile, or if a specific low vision user is zoomed in to the 200 plus percent on their computer? What specific considerations do you think we can make for that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, a lot of it would probably be applicable to CSS styling and accounting for different screen sizes and trying to make things as responsive as possible. Using probably some fluid typography. But yeah, and with that being said as well, the whole scroll locking that comes into play. Whether on different devices, there isn't necessarily a scroll element, but a touch element to still have that background page be scrollable. Is typically you don't want to lose that context of where you are on the page in the background versus where you are on the page in the foreground, or the dialogue in the foreground. So keeping that across all devices, keeping that context is key.
Right. So you mean like if I'm on my phone or like an iPad and I've scrolled halfway down the page, it pops up a modal.
Yep.
And I close that, making sure that it doesn't take me back to the top of the page.
Exactly.
Or something. Make sure it comes right back to where I was on the page.
Definitely.
It's a really, really great point there. Let's see. I'll give it just a couple more seconds to see if we have any more questions pop up. And if not, we're going to have Amber come back in with some closing remarks. Just to reintroduce, this is Damon Cook, developer advocate from WP Engine. Again, personally, my favorite hosting provider. My name is Devin Egger, a senior software developer at HDC and writer at Master WP. You're watching the final closing presentation of WP Accessibility Day 2022. And it actually does not look like we have any more questions coming up. So I'm assuming that Amber will be joining us shortly. There she is.
Hello. This
Hey,
was
Amber.
a fabulous presentation. Thank you so much, Damon, for
Thank you for
closing
having
us out. I've been watching our viewer count tick up and up and up and up.
Yeah.
So very popular topic, very important, also sometimes tricky to get right.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So, well, I think we probably will. I'll wave goodbye to you all and just have myself in, and then we can do a little wrap up here. So thank you both.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Amber. Thanks, Devin.